Before this story ends, you are going to ask yourself one question. Not about Thomas Carter, not about the people locked in the dark beneath that white house on the county road. You are going to ask it about yourself. You are going to wonder whether you would have been different from the people of Dunmore County, who already knew and went home anyway. You will have an answer by the end. You may not like it. The morning Daniel Price came home with a 12-point buck strapped to the hood of his truck, the whole county road smelled of pine and cold mud. It was October, the kind of October that Kentucky does quietly, without fanfare. The leaves going brown and rust-colored along the ridgelines, the creek water running dark and slow behind the Harlan property. He had been out since before first light, the way he always hunted, alone and patient, moving through the old-growth timber on the east side of Copperhead Ridge like he was born to it, which, in a sense, he was. His father had taught him those woods before Daniel could read a street sign, and his father's father before that. The Price family had been in Dunmore County since before it had a proper name. He stopped at Edna Gale's filling station on Route 9 to put gas in the truck, and Edna came out from behind the screen door with a thermos of coffee she sometimes kept warm for the early hunters. She was a round woman in her 60s, permanently suspicious of anyone she hadn't known for at least a decade. But she had known Daniel his whole life and considered him close enough to harmless. She looked at the buck without saying anything for a moment. Then she said it was a good one, and Daniel said, "Yes, ma'am," and they left it at that. That was the rhythm of conversation in Dunmore County. Long silences that meant everything. He was back on the gravel road leading toward his cabin when he noticed the smoke. Not chimney smoke, not the low grey curl of wood burning in a stove. This was something else, darker and lower to the ground, rising from a draw about half a mile off the main trail through a stand of black walnut trees that had no business being cleared. He pulled the truck to the shoulder and sat for a moment with the engine idling. In a county where nobody much explained themselves, and fewer still asked questions, smoke in the wrong place was the kind of thing you noted and moved past. He was tired. The buck was heavy. His left knee had been aching since August. He turned off the engine. The draw was steeper than he remembered, the walls of it slick with the kind of moss that only grows where sunlight almost never reaches. He came down through the walnut trees, moving slowly, one hand on the slope for balance, and he heard the voices before he saw anything. 2 men, maybe 3, the words indistinct, absorbed by the dense canopy above. He moved to the left and crouched behind a rotting deadfall and looked through the gap between 2 trunks. 3 men stood at the base of the draw, near a natural shelf of shale rock. The youngest was perhaps 25, the other 2 older and broader, all of them wearing work clothes, dark with effort. They had tools, shovels and a mattock, and what looked like a length of chain coiled near the base of a pine. The thing they were working around was covered in canvas, and the shape beneath the canvas was not firewood. Daniel had field-dressed enough animals in his life to understand the particular geometry of what lay still under that fabric, and this had the wrong geometry entirely. He did not move for a very long time. When he finally eased back up the draw and reached his truck, his hands were steady, but something behind his ribs was not. He sat in the cab and looked at the road and the trees and the ordinary grey sky of an October morning, and understood that everything he had just seen was going to be very difficult to explain to anyone who had not seen it themselves. The Dunmore County Sheriff's Office occupied a cinder block building at the edge of the town proper, which was not so much a town as a collection of purposes arranged along a quarter-mile of Route 9. There was the filling station, a hardware store, a church of indeterminate denomination, and a diner called Pauline's, where the coffee was bad and the eggs were worse. And everyone ate there anyway, because there was nowhere else. The sheriff was a man named Roy Lester, who had held the position for 11 years on the strength of being the only person who wanted it. He was not a bad man. He was a careful one, which in Dunmore County amounted to the same thing most of the time. Daniel sat across from Lester's desk and told him what he had seen in the drawer off the East Trail, starting with the smoke and ending with the canvas-covered shape and the chain. He told it plainly, the way he told everything, without decoration or emphasis, because he thought the facts were sufficient. Lester listened, with his forearms resting on the desk and his eyes moving occasionally to the window. When Daniel finished, Lester was quiet for a moment. He asked Daniel how far out he had been from the actual activity when he observed it. Daniel said, maybe 40 yards. Lester asked if he had been drinking the night before, and Daniel looked at him for a long moment before saying, no. Lester said that Copperhead Ridge was close to the Cutter property and the Haverford property, and that both families had been known to do hog processing in that draw in the fall. Daniel said what he saw was not a hog. Lester looked at the window again. He told Daniel he would look into it. He said it in the particular tone that men in small jurisdictions use when they have decided something without saying so. A tone that means the looking into it will be careful and slow and produce no immediate results. Daniel stood up and put his hat back on and walked out into the pale morning. For the next 3 days, he asked around quietly, the way you ask around in a county where asking questions directly is considered a form of aggression. He spoke to Jimmy Tolbert, who ran the feed supply and knew everything that moved in and out of the county on 4 legs. He spoke to old Carl Messer, who had trapped the eastern watershed for 50 years and treated the ridge like his personal register. He spoke to his nearest neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Frances Witt, who had lived alone since her husband passed, and who had, over the years, developed a remarkably comprehensive awareness of local movement, simply because she had nothing else to do, and her kitchen window faced north. Frances told him something that Roy Lester had not. She said the Carters had been buying more supplies than usual over the past 2 years. More salt, more kerosene, more of the large-gauge chain that Bobby Adkins stocked at the hardware store. She said it quietly, looking at her hands, and she did not say what she thought it meant. But she said it, and that was the thing. She said it, and then she looked up at Daniel with eyes that had understood something for a long time and had chosen not to take that understanding anywhere useful. And he saw in those eyes the particular exhaustion of a person who has carried knowledge they were afraid of. He thanked her and walked home through the dark. The Carter property sat 3 miles up a side road that branched off Route 9 to the north, past a rusted cattle gate that was never closed, past a mailbox that had been leaning at a 45-degree angle for so long it seemed structural. The house itself was a 2-story frame construction, painted white at some point in the distant past, the paint now the color of old bone, the porch sagging gently on one side, like a shoulder turned away from company. There were outbuildings, a proper barn, solid and maintained in ways the house was not. A smaller structure behind it, windowless. A third building, partially concealed behind a stand of cedars that Daniel could see from the road, but could not identify at that distance. He drove up the following Tuesday afternoon, which was something he had thought about carefully. Afternoons were social. An evening visit would have implied urgency or confrontation. A morning visit would have seemed investigative. An afternoon in the middle of the week was simply a neighbor stopping by, which was a thing neighbors did. though Daniel had never in his life stopped by the Carter place for any reason. Thomas Carter answered the door before Daniel reached the steps. That was the first thing. He was already there, as if he had been watching from somewhere inside, which meant either he had heard the truck coming for longer than was natural, or he had been standing at the window for some time before that. He was a large man, not heavy, but wide through the shoulders, with grey hair cut close and a face that had weathered decades of outdoor work into a kind of weathered stillness. His eyes were pale, and they settled on Daniel with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man who spent a great deal of time assessing things. He smiled and said, "Daniel Price," and extended a hand and said it had been a long while. Daniel shook the hand and said he had been out this way and thought he would stop. Carter said that was neighbourly and invited him in, and Daniel went in because there was no good reason not to, and several good reasons too. The inside of the house was ordinary in ways that felt deliberate. A clean kitchen with a linoleum floor, a sitting room with a couch and a television set, a game show playing with the sound low, family photographs on one wall, women and children in the studied poses of the 1940s. Carter offered coffee, and Daniel accepted, and they sat at the kitchen table and spoke about the hunting season, about whether it had been a dry enough fall to keep the deer moving, about the road conditions on the north end of the county. Carter spoke about these things with the ease of a man who was entirely comfortable with himself, which was not the same thing as innocence, but could resemble it closely enough to be confusing. It was only when Daniel let his eyes move naturally around the room, the way eyes do when a person appears to be relaxed and is not, that he saw the door at the far end of the hallway. It was not hidden. It was simply a door. But it had 2 padlocks on it, both new, both closed, and the wood of the frame around it had been recently reinforced with a strip of steel bolted at intervals. Daniel looked at it for perhaps 2 seconds, and then looked back at Carter, and Carter was looking at him with those pale eyes, and the same steady, pleasant expression. And Daniel understood that Carter had seen him notice the door, and was waiting to see what Daniel would do about it. Daniel finished his coffee, and said it had been good to catch up, and he needed to get back before the light went. Carter walked him to the door, and stood on the porch as he drove away, watching until the truck turned back onto the main road. He went back to Lester that evening, and told him about the door. Lester said that a man was entitled to lock a door on his own property. Daniel said that was true, and that he had also made some inquiries about the amount of supplies the Carter family had been purchasing over the past 2 years, relative to the number of people known to live on the property, which was 3 by the county tax records, and that the quantity of salt and grain and lamp oil did not correspond to 3 people, unless those 3 people were being extraordinarily cautious about winter. Lester looked at the window for a longer time than usual. The next morning, Lester came to Daniel's cabin himself, which had not happened in the 11 years Lester had been sheriff. He sat in the cab of his cruiser for a moment before getting out, as if he was deciding something. And then he came to the door and said he was going out to the Carter place, and that he wanted Daniel with him, because Daniel had better knowledge of the land in case they needed to move through the timber quickly. He did not say what he thought they might find. Daniel put on his boots and got his jacket, and they drove north on Route 9 in the grey morning, with the low fog sitting in the hollows the way it did in November, filling the spaces between the hills with something that looked like standing water. They brought 2 additional men, both deputies who had been sworn in by Lester during a particularly bad summer 3 years prior, and had since mostly written speeding citations. The 4 of them walked up the Carter Drive, with the dead leaves absorbing their footsteps, and the barn standing quiet in the damp air. Thomas Carter answered the door again before they reached the steps. This time, there was no coffee. Carter listened to Lester explain that there had been some reports of suspicious activity in the eastern watershed, and that he was doing a general welfare check in the area. Carter said that was fine, and that he had nothing to hide, and said it with the kind of calm that people use when they are not afraid of you. And there is a meaningful difference between the calm of an innocent man and the calm of a man who has calculated his risk and concluded it is manageable. Lester asked if they could look around the property, and Carter said, of course, and walked them through the barn without being asked. The barn that was full of nothing unusual. Hay and tools, and an old John Deere tractor with a cracked manifold. Then Lester said he would like to see the interior of the house. Carter said he was welcome to. They went through the ordinary kitchen, the ordinary sitting room, the family photographs. The television was off this time. Carter's wife appeared from somewhere at the back of the house and stood near the staircase without speaking. A tall woman in her 50s, with the same quality of studied stillness her husband carried. And two younger men, who were presumably sons, came in from outside and stood in the kitchen doorway. The dynamic in the room shifted the way pressure shifts before weather changes. Everyone was standing still and watching. Lester reached the hallway and stopped in front of the padlocked door and asked what was behind it. Carter said it was storage. Lester asked if he could see inside. Carter said he would need to find the key. He said it pleasantly. He turned and walked toward the kitchen, and one of the deputies turned off his flashlight to change the batteries at the wrong moment. And in the 4 seconds of darkness that followed, someone very large moved very fast from the kitchen doorway and hit the deputy holding the flashlight before the flashlight came back on. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not orderly. Chairs went over. Someone hit the wall hard enough to knock one of the family photographs to the floor. Daniel had put himself instinctively against the far wall the moment the flashlight went out, and he was the only person in that hallway who had not been displaced by the collision in the dark. He was also the closest person to the padlocked door. Through the noise and the struggling, he heard something from behind it. Not the house settling. Not pipes. A human sound. Low and stripped of strength. The kind of sound a person makes when they have been making noise for a very long time and have nearly stopped believing it matters. Lester got the door open 6 minutes later with a pry bar from the barn, and the 2 padlocks still attached to their housings pulled clear of the reinforced frame by force. The smell came out ahead of the light. It was the smell of a space that had been occupied by living things for a long time, without adequate ventilation or sanitation. Dense and organic, and wrong in a way that lodged at the back of the throat. The stairs went down steeply. Lester went first with his flashlight, and Daniel went second, and one of the deputies followed. The basement was low-ceilinged and larger than the footprint of the house above suggested, extending back and to the right beneath what must have been the yard. The walls were stone and packed earth. The floor was earth. In the beam of the flashlight, details emerged slowly, the way things do when the mind resists processing them too quickly. 3 people, 2 women and 1 man, all in their 30s or thereabouts, all sitting or lying against the far wall in the posture of people who had learned not to move suddenly, because sudden movements had consequences. Their wrists showed the particular thickening that comes from prolonged restraint. Their eyes, when the flashlight beam moved across their faces, reacted with the involuntary flinching of people who had been in the dark for a very long time. The man was the one who had made the sound. He was closest to the stairs, and he had clearly heard what was happening above, because he had dragged himself to the base of the steps and sat with his back against the lowest riser, which was how he had been able to make noise at all. When Lester crouched down and said he was the county sheriff and that they were going to get him out, the man did not speak.
He looked at Lester's face for a long time, with an expression that had long since moved past hope, and was now attempting to reconstruct it from very old materials. The women were further back. One of them was unresponsive, breathing but not reacting, in a state that Dr.
Clarence Booker, called out from his practice in the county seat 2 hours later, would describe as consistent with prolonged deprivation and psychological withdrawal. The other was conscious and oriented enough to give her name, which she did in a voice that had almost no volume left in it. Her name was Louise Prater. She'd been reported missing from a county east of Dunmore 18 months prior. The objects in the basement told the rest of the story, the way objects always do when people can no longer speak. A woman's shoe with an ankle strap, alone. No partner anywhere in the space. A man's wallet, emptied of its currency, but still holding a driver's license from a state none of those present were from. A child's photograph, creased and handled to transparency at the corners. The kind of photograph a person carries when they are far from home and need to remember why it matters. Lengths of chain, calibrated and bolted to iron rings sunk into the stone wall, not improvised, but constructed with forethought, as if whoever built this room had known from the beginning what it would hold. Upstairs, Thomas Carter sat in a kitchen chair with his hands zip-tied behind him and spoke to Lester in the same level, pleasant voice he had been using since the first visit. He confirmed that there were people in the basement. He described it, without apparent affect, as a labor arrangement that had become complicated over time. He spoke of the county's economic difficulties and the scarcity of willing labor, and the impracticality of paying wages at the scale the farm required. And he spoke of all this in the manner of a man explaining a reasonable business decision to someone who simply needed more context. His wife said nothing. His sons said nothing. The younger of the two sons was sitting against the kitchen wall with his head down, and Daniel, standing near the back door, noticed that the young man's wrists had old scar tissue at the points where manacles would have rested. He was perhaps 30. He had the Carter family's width through the shoulders and the Carter family's pale eyes. But those eyes were aimed at the floor, with a specific quality of emptiness that Daniel recognized from the faces of the people in the basement. Not the blankness of a man who felt nothing. The blankness of a man who had decided, some time ago, to feel nothing as a survival strategy. Daniel said nothing about this to Lester at that moment. He waited until they were outside in the cold air, and he said it quietly, and Lester looked back at the house for a moment, and then walked back inside without speaking. The trials were held in the county seat because the Dunmore County Courthouse was not adequate in size or structural integrity to accommodate the proceedings that followed. There were 4 members of the Carter family charged across a range of offences that the district attorney, a methodical woman named Patricia Hollowell, who had driven down from Lexington with 2 assistants and a filing cabinet of precedents, described in her opening remarks as representing a sustained criminal enterprise that had operated with the knowledge, if not the active participation, of an entire community. That was the sentence that changed things. Hollowell said it simply, without drama, on the first morning of proceedings, and the room went quiet in a particular way. Louise Prater testified on the 3rd day. She had recovered enough physical strength to sit upright without assistance, and enough of her voice to be heard in the back of the room without amplification. But she spoke in the careful, rationed way of someone who has learned that words cost something. She described being offered a ride by Thomas Carter on a county road during a rainstorm. She described arriving at the property under a false pretense. She described the door closing behind her. She said something near the end of her testimony that did not make it into the newspaper summaries, which tended toward the procedural and the quantifiable. The judge asked her if there was anything else she wanted to say for the record, and she said that on her second day in the basement, she had heard a car stop on the road outside, which was close enough to the basement air vent that she could hear the gravel shift, and she had screamed until her voice gave out. She said the car sat for what felt like several minutes and then drove away. She said she had thought about that car for 18 months. If you have stayed with this story until this moment, you already understand that what happened in Dunmore County was never only about one family. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the cases we bring you are not simply stories of evil. They are stories about the silence that allows evil to persist. And there are more of them than most people are prepared to believe. It was Edna Gale at the filling station who finally told Lester what she had known. She came to him voluntarily 2 weeks into the trial and sat in the chair across his desk that Daniel had sat in 2 months earlier, and looked at her hands in the same way Frances Witt had looked at hers. She said that 6 years ago she had seen Thomas Carter loading something into the back of his truck behind the old feed barn, something large under a tarp, and that she had known at that moment, with the certainty you feel when you know something you cannot prove, and she had told no one. She said she had been telling herself for 6 years that she might have been wrong about what she saw. Lester listened and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked her if she thought she had been wrong. She said no. She said she had never thought she was wrong, not for a single day. She said she had been afraid. Carl Messer came forward next. Then Bobby Adkins from the hardware store. Then a man who ran a bait shop near the Northern Creek, who said he had observed what he believed to be a person confined in the back of a Carter vehicle in 1958, and had decided he had probably misread the situation. Each of them sat in the chair across from Lester's desk. Each of them looked at their hands. Each of them said, in different words, that they had known something was wrong, and had made the calculation that saying so would cost them more than staying silent. Patricia Hollowell added charges to the case based on these testimonies. The charges did not apply to Edna or Carl or Bobby or the man from the bait shop. There was no legal mechanism to charge them with what they had done, which was to hear screaming from a basement and drive away. There was no statute covering the willingness of a community to maintain a shared agreement not to look too closely at something everyone had noticed. Thomas Carter was sentenced to life imprisonment. His wife received 22 years. One son received 12 years, and the other received 8. The young man with the scarred wrists was not charged. He had been confined in that basement for 2 years before being released, and incorporated into the family structure under conditions that Hollowell described in court as coercive and ongoing. He was a Carter by blood, but had not been a Carter by choice for a very long time. He sat in the 3rd row of the courtroom on the day the sentences were read, next to a county social worker who had been assigned to his case. He was the only member of his family who wept when the gavel came down. Daniel Price drove back to his cabin after the last day of sentencing and sat on the porch in the cold and looked at the tree line going dark against the early evening sky. He thought about Louise Prater in the rain on a county road, accepting a ride from a man who seemed ordinary. He thought about Edna Gale hearing the gravel shift under a car on the road outside the Carter property and making her calculation. He thought about the years that had passed between those 2 moments and all the ordinary days in between, the bad coffee at Pauline's, the hunting seasons, the leaves going rust-coloured along the ridgelines, the county road smelling of pine and mud, and all of it happening simultaneously with what was happening 3 miles north, in a basement, under a house that looked from the road like every other house in the county.
He had done the right thing, people told him afterward. He had gone to the sheriff when it mattered and helped bring it to an end. He thought about that for a long time on the porch. 3 years later, Roy Lester retired. At the small gathering held at Pauline's in his honor, he made a short speech in which he thanked the community for its support over more than a decade of service. 12 people applauded. The man from the bait shop was there. Bobby Adkins was there. Edna Gale was there. They ate the bad eggs and drank the bad coffee and shook Lester's hand, and nobody said the name Carter, and nobody mentioned the basement, and nobody spoke about the car that had sat on the gravel road outside while a woman screamed herself silent, 20 feet underground. 2 weeks later, a new sheriff was sworn in, and the county went on the way counties do. The Carter property was sold at auction in 1962. A family from Ohio bought it. They had never heard of the Carters. They repainted the house white, planted flowers along the porch railing, and told everyone they met that it was the most peaceful place they had ever lived. They meant it sincerely. They slept well every night.
Tell us in the comments whether you think Roy Lester and the people of Dunmore County bear responsibility for what Louise Prater endured in that basement. There is a legal answer to that question, and a human one, and they are not the same answer. And that difference is exactly what we are here to talk about.